A book review of The Coming of the Fairies by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and reviewed by Fairy Princess Lully. Merry meet, Fae friends, and welcome to my book review of The Coming of the Fairies by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. My goal with this review is less to critique the writing style, grammar, plot devices, or other such things, and more to give a general impression of the book and then drill down into specific passages, ideas, references, etc. that I found particularly interesting or thought-provoking. It is often these things that make a book interesting and meaningful to me, and in the spirit of sharing with you a genuine book review, I shall endeavor to share what genuinely interests me, rather than a cookie-cutter product review. First, an overview. This was an interesting peek into the minds and controversy of the Cottingley Fairy pictures, which you may be familiar with as the girls who are photographed with fairies interacting with them from the early 20th century. Some of the foregoing experts and psychics at the time were very divided on the authenticity of these pictures. The book starts with the reproduction of a series of exchanged letters, and this can be somewhat tedious to read. Once the letters have been completed, though, we come to the various arguments for and against the authenticity of the pictures, and this becomes rather enlightening, if for no other reason than the sheer amount of tales and stories that are unearthed in an effort to establish a case for their genuineness. Also, be prepared to read an affected sort of prose, because this writing is about 100 years old, and that is reflected in the mode of speech the authors and writers of the letters use. If you aren't used to reading antiquated writing, this can be kind of off-putting, but comparatively speaking, it isn't all that difficult. There are quite a few passages that I found interesting throughout the last half of the book, as well as some references to other interesting texts. So I am going to bring these up one by one and read them to you here, and then discuss what I found of particular interest. Passage number 1, and I have trimmed these for their salient parts. There have always been many different races of fairyland, and that samples of these races may greatly differ from each other and may inhabit varying spots. This is a sentiment that was echoed by Tolkien, who was born about 40 years after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And Tolkien put it very succinctly and beautifully, I think. His quote related to this passage from the book is, "Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons." Tolkien is often seen as so authoritative that I found it interesting to know that this idea of his may have actually been borrowed or built upon from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle initially. And I also find it to be very synchronous with my own understandings of the Enchanted Realms, which are often referred to as the Realm of Fairy, and it consists of many different creatures. The second passage I am also going to verbally edit for the sake of speed, and it reads as thus. "We received communications from a fairy named Bebel, or Bebel, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, who told us that he was a leprechaun male, but that in a ruined fort near us dwelt the pixies. Our domain had been the habitation of the leprechauns always, and that they with their queen Pycelle, or Pykel, mounted on her gorgeous dragonfly, found all they required in our grounds." I found this passage interesting for a couple of reasons. First, that I always find the direct naming of fairies interesting, because anybody who is well-versed in the fairy magical arts knows that knowing the name of a fairy is said to give you great power over that fairy. So I find it particularly curious whenever there have been interactions that are reported that actually name the fae that was being interacted with. Somewhat more interesting to me, though, was that this was a leprechaun who was speaking about the Leprechaun Queen, who is also named. And this is interesting because there is no official folklore or texts that talk about female leprechauns at all, or even how leprechauns come into being. So it's interesting, and this is the only time I have ever actually heard of what the leprechaun hierarchy might be, or that there are even women amongst them, and I find that quite unique and fascinating. I did try to dig a little bit deeper on the name of this Leprechaun Queen, but as of yet I have been unable to find any further information. The next two excerpts I'm going to read together because they're somewhat related in that they both talk about fairy lore. And the first is a Manx quote, and the Manx are a Celtic people who are from the Isle of Man. Manx girls, who to this day will not forget the bit of wood and coal put ready at the side of the fireplace in case the little people call and need a fire. I just find this a really fun little tidbit of fairy folklore and tradition that would make for a really good addition to an altar or to any magically workings that somebody may be doing. The next one is an interesting bit of lore about New World Fairies, and it goes, the vast plains of the Dakotas are inhabited by a black and white kind of fairy, that is, which I have not seen elsewhere, and California rejoices in a lovely white and gold species which also appears to be unique. Now, I found this passage interesting, one, because fairy folklore in the New World is not as prolific as it is in Western Europe or the Old World, and it certainly takes a very different form. So it's interesting to hear fairies described in this way, and this strikes me as very European, because this is not usually how the Native American folklore describes their fae folk, such as the Nunahee. These last two quotes I'm going to also read together because they both speak somewhat philosophically to the question of what are fairies? Speaking directly about fairies, the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, asks the first quote, which is, can these be thought forms? And this is an interesting phrase because of the idea that fae are thought forms. And thought forms are a reference to Plato's theory of forms or ideas, wherein Plato posits that objects in the physical world are imperfect manifestations of the ideal idea of the thing, which is the most pure and infinite form of it. So what's being suggested here by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is that possibly the fae are the visible manifestation of something here in the physical world, and they are that thing in its purest form. This is a notion that I kind of like because it speaks to the ethereal form of the fae and their ever-changing nature, which evolves side by side with the evolution of humanity. Building on that, we have the next quote. One may well ask what connection has this fairy lore with the general scheme of psychic philosophy. The connection is slight and indirect, consisting only in the fact that anything which widens our conceptions of the possible and shakes us out of our time-rutted lines of thought helps us to regain our elasticity of mind and thus to be more open to new philosophies. This quote speaks to the notion that the fae are, at least in some form, part of the hidden realm of imagination, vision, dreams, inspiration, and creativity, and that our attempts to describe and interact with them are really our attempts to call upon sections of our own consciousness and or efforts to connect with a more expansive consciousness. And last but not least, one of the fun things that I like to do when I am reading new books is to find new vocabulary words and or extracurricular book reading from references to books that I haven't heard of that are made by the author. And this particular book had a fun reference to a fairy-inspired piece of music called Five Fairy Ballads, and this was written by Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was a person of color and very good composer in the 19th century. And so I'm just going to play for you a couple little excerpts because I went down the rabbit hole of looking up the Five Fairy Ballads to see what they sounded like, and they're actually quite charming. So I'm going to play some of this for you. It is opera, so be prepared, but I think you will enjoy it. And with this, I will bring the book review to an end. Please, if you enjoyed it today, hit the like and subscribe button and leave a comment if you like. I always love feedback. I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Hello friends, this is Gone for Hammerhands. Thank you for checking out Fairy Princess Lolly's channel. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. And if you'd like to support these magical creations, fly over to our Patreon and join the fairy family. Safe travels!